Yeah. You're under arrest on suspicion of murder on the 10th of this month, November, in the Meadows.
Stand still. Stand still. I want you to raise your jacket up. Want to see if you've got anything. Turn round. Right. Walk towards me. Walk towards me. Stop.
Nottingham is a city known for its history and culture. But behind the scenes, a darker story has been unfolding. In recent years, drug gangs have brought violence to its streets, turning parts of the city into battlegrounds. One gang in particular, led by Tremaine Mackenzie and Jezekiel Dennis, ran a drug operation that ended in bloodshed, fear, and eventually long prison sentences. Their group was heavily involved in selling cocaine and using weapons to protect their business. Things reached a breaking point in November 2021 when a man named Michael O'Connor was stabbed to death in a quiet residential street. This killing exposed far more than a personal feud. It pulled back the curtain on a gang willing to use deadly force to stay in control. In this story, we'll look at who these men were, how they built their drug empire, and how police worked to take them down. It's a story of greed, violence, and the damage caused when people choose crime over community. Tremaine Mackenzie was well known to police long before the murder that would bring him to national attention. Living in Nottingham, he had been involved in drug dealing for years. He wasn't just selling small amounts on the street. Mackenzie was at the top of a growing operation, moving large amounts of cocaine and making serious money. He was smart, organized, and dangerous. Police say he ran his gang like a business, but one built on violence and fear. By his side was Jezekiel Dennis, another key player in the group. Dennis helped keep the gang running smoothly, making sure drugs were delivered, debts were collected, and problems were dealt with quickly, sometimes with force. The pair didn't act alone. The gang was made up of more than a dozen men, each with their own role. Some were drivers, some acted as lookouts, and others delivered drugs or carried weapons. The group operated across Nottingham and beyond. They used safe houses to store cocaine, burner phones to arrange deals, and cars with hidden compartments to move drugs around. They took steps to stay out of sight, rotating vehicles, avoiding contact with known offenders, and using women or younger gang members to front deals in riskier areas. But their lifestyle told a different story. Photos shared on social media showed holidays abroad, designer clothes, champagne in clubs, and fast cars on quiet city streets. It wasn't hard to guess the money wasn't clean. Police would later say that the gang's flashy spending habits helped investigators confirm how deeply involved they were in drug dealing. Behind the Instagram posts and designer labels was a system held together by threats and violence. Anyone who crossed the gang, whether rival dealers, customers, or even former associates, risked serious harm. There were reports of beatings, intimidation, and retaliatory attacks, some of which never made the news. Their world was secretive, but like many gangs, greed and pride made them careless. Arguments over money and territory with other dealers created tension, and as police would later reveal, these tensions would eventually lead to murder. This wasn't a group of petty criminals. They were organized, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to keep control of their drug business. But while they thought they were untouchable, they didn't realize just how closely the police were watching. By late 2021, tensions in Nottingham's drug world were rising. Mackenzie's gang had made a name for themselves, but their growing success brought enemies. There were whispers of rival dealers encroaching on their patch, and trust within their own group was beginning to show cracks. Power, money, and status were all in play, and each man involved had something to lose. The man caught in the middle was Michael O'Connor, a 31-year-old from Alexandra Park. O'Connor wasn't part of Mackenzie's gang, but he had connections across Nottingham's drug scene. Some believed he was working with a competing group. Others said he was simply trying to broker peace between feuding factions. What's certain is that Mackenzie's gang saw him as a threat, and in their world, threats had to be dealt with quickly. On the evening of November 10th, 2021, O'Connor was called to Wilford Crescent West, a residential street in the Meadows. He believed he was helping settle a dispute. He brought no weapon, but it was a trap, an ambush planned down to the minute. As he arrived, a group of masked men emerged and attacked. Within moments, O'Connor was stabbed through the chest. The violence was fast and targeted. The men who struck him ran off almost immediately, leaving him bleeding on the ground. Despite the best efforts of emergency services, he was pronounced dead at the scene. He never stood a chance. The murder sent shockwaves through the community. The Meadows, while no stranger to crime, had never seen such a cold, calculated killing in broad daylight on a quiet street. Neighbors recalled the sirens, the flashing blue lights, and the helpless feeling of watching paramedics try to save a man already beyond help. It didn't take long for detectives to realize this wasn't a random street fight. The men who killed O'Connor weren't locals. They'd been brought in from Manchester and Birmingham, paid to carry out the hit. This was a gang sending a message, not just to O'Connor, but to anyone who might be thinking of crossing them. In the hours that followed, Nottingham's streets remained on edge. Tensions between rival groups simmered just beneath the surface, and police braced for further retaliation. Then, in a separate incident just minutes after the murder, Jessica Dennis was caught on CCTV trying to fire a gun at another man believed to be linked to a rival gang. The gun jammed. No one was shot. But the warning was loud and clear. This wasn't about personal beefs or petty arguments. This was a turf war, one with its own rules, its own economy, and its own body count. And Michael O'Connor, whether knowingly or not, had become part of it. What looked like one night of violence was in fact the climax of months of growing pressure between criminal groups fighting over power, profit, and survival. And that single act, a knife in the chest on a quiet residential street, would be the beginning of the end for Mackenzie's gang. Police had seen enough. They knew there was more going on beneath the surface. And now, with a man dead and CCTV linking the gang to an attempted shooting just streets away, the hunt was on. The murder of Michael O'Connor triggered one of Nottinghamshire Police's biggest investigations in recent years. Codenamed Operation Haversack, the inquiry would go far beyond a single stabbing. It would uncover a web of criminal activity, violent intimidation, and drug trafficking that had gone unchecked for far too long. From the beginning, detectives believed the attack had been planned. The level of coordination, using men from out of town, burner phones, and fake names, made it clear this wasn't a spontaneous street fight. So officers started from the ground up, piecing together evidence from mobile phone data, CCTV, vehicle tracking, and witness accounts. CCTV footage proved invaluable. Cameras across Nottingham captured the movements of key gang members and the hired attackers in the days leading up to the murder. One car, a black Toyota, was picked up travelling repeatedly between Birmingham and Nottingham, carrying members of the hit team. Detectives followed this trail and matched times, dates, and movements with call records and hotel bookings. Police also tapped into communications data. They discovered that Mackenzie and others were in near constant contact with their associates in the days before the murder. Phones were activated and deactivated within short windows, used only once or twice before being discarded. Messages were sent using encrypted apps and through public Wi-Fi to mask the source. They also traced hotel records. Rooms were booked under false names, often for only one night, but investigators managed to cross-reference these with CCTV of gang members checking in, often in groups, carrying bags or meeting other associates in the lobby. These seemingly small details helped build a broader picture of how the hit had been organized. Surveillance footage caught Jezekiel Dennis just minutes after the murder attempting to shoot a rival, another moment that helped police show that violence was not just a response, but part of a deliberate campaign to control territory. Over the following months, police carried out coordinated raids across Nottingham, Birmingham, and Manchester. They seized burner phones, clothing worn during the attack, cash, drugs, weapons, and encrypted devices. They also found Class A drugs being processed for street-level supply, clear proof of a large-scale drug operation running alongside the violence. Detectives built a timeline that mapped who gave orders, who carried them out, and who tried to clean up the mess. By the time the case reached the Crown Prosecution Service, they had enough evidence to charge Mackenzie, Dennis, and 12 others with offences including conspiracy to murder, drug trafficking, firearms offences, and money laundering. Police described Operation Haversack as a turning point, not just because of the number of convictions, but because of the level of cooperation and detail involved. The case showed how a patient, data-driven approach could bring down even the most secretive of criminal gangs. The arrests began quietly. Police moved in on key suspects across Nottingham, Birmingham, and Manchester, timing the raids to avoid any leaks or sudden disappearances. Within days, Tremaine Mackenzie, Jezekiel Dennis, and several other gang members were in custody. The rest were rounded up soon after. Each man was brought in for questioning, but most refused to talk. Many gave no-comment interviews, hoping silence would protect them. They denied knowing each other, denied being in Nottingham that night, denied everything. But the evidence told a different story, and it was piling up fast. The trial, held at Nottingham Crown Court, lasted over 4 months. It involved 14 defendants, each facing a range of serious charges: conspiracy to murder, firearms offences, drug supply, money laundering. Security at the court was tight, and the public gallery was often full, with families of both the defendants and the victim attending regularly. Prosecutors laid out the case methodically. They presented maps, call records, travel logs, and CCTV timelines that showed exactly where each man had been in the lead-up to the murder. Mobile phone data showed calls bouncing off masts in Nottingham, perfectly matching the movements of vehicles on camera. Hotel records, license plate recognition, and witness statements built a picture that left little room for doubt. Perhaps the most chilling evidence came from the group's planning. Jurors saw text messages, often written in code, arranging logistics and meeting points. There were messages referring to weapons, money, and locations, all backed up by surveillance footage and forensic links. Even the clothes worn during the attack were matched to those found in gang members' homes during raids. Throughout the trial, Mackenzie and Dennis tried to distance themselves from the planning. Their legal teams argued that others acted independently, that the pair had no role in organizing the killing. But the jury wasn't convinced. The structure of the gang, the leadership roles, and the digital footprint left behind told a different story. All 14 men were found guilty, some of murder, others of manslaughter, and the rest for their roles in the wider conspiracy. The verdict marked one of Nottingham's largest gangland convictions in recent memory. As the jury filed out, there was no emotion from Mackenzie or Dennis. But outside the courtroom, police officers spoke of relief, and the family of Michael O'Connor finally saw the men responsible held to account. In September 2024, the final chapter of the case was written in court as the 14 men were sentenced for their roles in the murder of Michael O'Connor and the wider criminal enterprise. The group received a combined total of more than 85 years in prison, bringing a sense of justice to a community left shaken by their actions. Tremaine Mackenzie, described by the judge as the gang's leader and decision-maker, was handed a 30-year sentence. The court heard how Mackenzie planned the ambush that led to O'Connor's death and used violence and threats to protect his drug empire. His close associate, Jessica Dennis, was jailed for 22 years. He was found guilty of manslaughter and firearm possession, with the court citing his role in the attempted shooting just minutes after the murder. The other members of the gang received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years, depending on their involvement in the attack or the drug network it was tied to. Some were convicted of manslaughter, others for assisting an offender, firearms offences, or conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. The judge did not mince words. He described the group as a dangerous and organised gang who showed no regard for human life. He added that the killing of Michael O'Connor was not just a murder but a message, a display of power in a battle for territory and control. The sentences, he said, had to reflect the seriousness of what took place that night and the broader harm the gang had done to the community. Police welcomed the result. Senior detectives from Nottinghamshire Police and the National Crime Agency said the case showed what could be achieved through persistence and cooperation. They noted that dismantling the gang had not only delivered justice for Michael O'Connor's family, but had also broken apart a network responsible for spreading fear and drugs across Nottingham and beyond. But for many watching, there's a sense that justice doesn't undo the damage. Michael O'Connor is still gone. Families have been devastated. Entire neighbourhoods were affected by the gang's violence and influence. Even with the gang behind bars, the question remains: how many others are ready to take their place? For now, Mackenzie, Dennis, and their associates will serve their time, stripped of the power they once held. But the problem they represented, of young men drawn into violent criminal life in pursuit of money and control, still hangs over cities like Nottingham.
The moment the assassin, Anis, is seen fleeing after shooting a millionaire in front of his wife and children. He wasn't just another London resident. Flamma Bikiri was a known figure in Europe's criminal underworld, linked to drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and a violent gang feud stretching from Sweden to the UK. On paper, he was a music executive. In reality, he was a marked man. It all came to a head on Christmas Eve 2019 outside his £1.5 million home in Battersea. Just after 9 p.m, Bikiri returned home with his wife and child. As they approached the front door, a man in a high-vis jacket and latex mask appeared from the shadows. 10 shots were fired. 8 hit Bikiri in the back. He died on the pavement as his family watched in horror. But the killer didn't just disappear, he left a trail. CCTV, DNA, and a ripped plane ticket pointed to Anis Hemesi, a Swedish kickboxer with no record. He had flown in, carried out the hit, and left the country within hours. What he didn't know was that police across Europe were already watching. A multi-agency operation tracked his movements, linked his network, and exposed the conspiracy behind the hit. This is the story of how a high-level gang feud ended in a London assassination, and how investigators traced it back across borders. Flamma Bikiri wasn't just a well-dressed man living in a £1.5 million townhouse in Battersea. He wasn't just the brother of Real Housewives of Cheshire star Missy Bikiri or a proud father of 2. Beneath the polished exterior and public image was something far more dangerous. A man deeply embedded in the heart of Europe's criminal underworld. Born in Albania but raised in Sweden, Bikiri had long attracted the attention of law enforcement. Though he presented himself as a music executive, Swedish police believed he was a high-ranking player in a major Albanian-Swedish organized crime group. He had previously been convicted for handling smuggled goods and was suspected of helping move millions in illegal imports across Scandinavia, drugs, weapons, alcohol, and counterfeit goods. Some charges didn't stick, others did. But to police, he was always more than just a name on paper. His network was tight. One of his closest associates was Daniel Petrovich, a known gang leader in Sweden. Another was Naif Adawi, a convicted armed robber connected to a £7 million security van heist back in 2010. These weren't small-time players. They were part of a criminal infrastructure that spanned borders, rivaled only by the Danish-based gang led by Arian Ari Mechko, another figure climbing fast in the drug trade across northern Europe. In the years leading up to his death, tensions between these groups had been steadily escalating. What began as competition for supply lines turned into something darker. In 2019, things exploded. Naif Adawi's partner, Caroline Hakim, was shot and killed while holding their infant child in Malmö. It was an execution, carried out in public, a chilling statement to those in the Petrovsky network. No one was untouchable. Bachiri had been close to both Adawi and Petrovich. He wasn't just connected, he was part of the inner circle. And in the aftermath of Hakim's murder, retaliation was expected. When it didn't come, speculation grew. Who would be next? The answer arrived on December 24th, 2019. Bachiri, back in London and living a seemingly quiet life, became the next target in a war that had started hundreds of miles away. His role as both insider and ally made him a valuable asset and a dangerous liability. To his enemies, he was more than a threat. He was a symbol. He'd left Sweden, but the conflict had followed him. And when the hit was finally ordered, it was done with planning, patience, and precision. This wasn't just a murder. It was a calculated elimination of a man who knew too much, stood too close, and couldn't be left alive. The man chosen to carry out the killing didn't fit the image of a professional assassin. Anis Hemesi was just 24 years old, a professional kickboxer from Malmö with no criminal record. On paper, he looked clean. No prior convictions, no ties to London gangs, no red flags that would have landed him on a watch list. And that's precisely why he was selected. Those behind the operation needed someone who could travel without raising suspicion. Hemesi's background made him the perfect ghost. A Swedish national arriving in the UK just before Christmas wouldn't stand out in a crowd. And in the middle of festive chaos, when airports were crammed and surveillance systems overwhelmed, his quiet arrival went unnoticed. But he didn't come empty-handed. Alongside him were the tools of transformation: a latex mask, high-visibility workwear, gloves, a litter picker, and a black beanie. He'd come to London to play a part, and the role was that of a street cleaner. Harmless, invisible, exactly what a hitman needed to be. For several nights before the attack, Hemesi patrolled the streets around Bachiri's home in Battersea, disguised in full costume. He blended into the background of the city, sweeping the pavement with his litter picker, silently watching. CCTV footage would later capture his strange presence, his movements robotic, his face fully obscured. One neighbour even questioned why he was cleaning both public and private roads. Hemesi said nothing and moved on. He was rehearsing, but like any production, he wasn't alone behind the scenes. From Sweden, Tobias Andersson and Bawa Karim were believed to be handling communications and planning. In London, Hemesi was supported by Clifford Rollox and Claude Isaac, who helped him secure equipment and navigate the local area. And then there was Esteban Munizaga, who rented the flat at Oyster Wharf, the safe house located just minutes from Bachiri's home. The setup was tight. The flat gave Hemesi a place to change, store supplies, and plan his route. He'd scoped out escape options, including a green lady's bicycle that would later prove essential to both his getaway and the investigation. The plan was simple but clinical. Wait outside Bachiri's home on Christmas Eve. Kill him the moment he arrived, disappear before anyone could react. But even perfect plans can fall apart. And for all the attention to detail, one small mistake was about to bring down the whole operation. It was just after 9 p.m. on Christmas Eve when Flamma Bachiri and his wife returned home to their £1.5 million townhouse in Battersea. Their young son was with them, barely old enough to understand what was happening. The family had spent the evening celebrating, wrapping gifts, enjoying the kind of quiet joy that defines Christmas for so many. But someone was waiting. Hidden in the shadows outside the house was Anis Hemisi, dressed head to toe as a street cleaner, high-vis jacket, gloves, a latex mask covering his face. To a passerby, he looked like someone finishing up a shift. To police reviewing the CCTV later, he looked like death in disguise. As the Bechiris approached their front door, Hemisi stepped forward without hesitation. He pulled out a handgun and fired 10 times. 8 of those bullets struck Flammer in the back. The father of 2 collapsed instantly, bleeding out on the pavement just meters from his own front door. His wife screamed. Their child stood frozen. The attack lasted seconds. It was cold, silent, and brutally effective. Neighbors, drawn by the noise, rushed to their windows and front doors, only to find a scene they couldn't quite process. The gunman didn't stick around. He was already in motion, cycling away on a green lady's bicycle chosen specifically to help him blend in. In a city where couriers and commuters use bikes daily, the image was forgettable, but to detectives, it would soon become a lead. Hemisi disappeared into the darkness. He returned to the safe house at Oyster Wharf, just minutes from the murder scene, and discarded his disguise. The gun, jacket, mask, and bicycle were all hidden inside. Within hours, he was on a flight out of the country. His departure, quiet and unchallenged, was a gut punch to investigators scrambling to identify the man responsible. At first, police didn't know what they were dealing with. Robbery was ruled out almost immediately. Nothing had been taken. This was a professional hit, carried out in one of London's wealthiest postcodes, and it didn't take long for them to connect the dots. Flammer Bekhiri wasn't just a family man or a successful music executive. He was known to police in Sweden, linked to organized criminal networks across Scandinavia. He had survived past investigations, even received a suspended sentence for handling smuggled goods, but his name had never been far from headlines, and never far from danger. This was no random shooting. It was the next chapter in a brutal feud stretching across Europe. And while Hemisi might have left the UK unnoticed, the evidence he left behind would soon do the talking. Within hours of the murder, detectives from the Met Specialist Crime Command were already piecing together the outline of what had just happened. The first clue came from a neighbor's security camera. It showed a man dressed like a street cleaner moving up and down the road in the days before the shooting, sweeping, loitering, blending in, but he wasn't cleaning anything. He was watching. The man's movements were consistent. Each night, he returned to the same area around Bekhiri's home in Battersea, always dressed in the same high-vis jacket, beanie hat, gloves, and latex mask. He carried a litter picker and moved like someone who belonged, but locals knew something was off. At one point, detectives now knew this was a premeditated hit. The next big break came from Oyster Wharf, a riverside flat just minutes from the crime scene. It had been rented by Estevan Pino Munizaga, a man with no known criminal history, but whose links to the case were too neat to ignore. CCTV had placed the fake street cleaner cycling to and from that same building. Inside, forensic teams found everything: the fluorescent jacket, the gloves, the litter picker, even the latex mask. But that wasn't all. Gunshot residue was recovered from the bicycle parked inside the flat, strongly suggesting it had been used immediately after the killing. DNA on food wrappers and drink bottles matched Hemisi. And most damning of all, a ripped boarding pass still in the bin with part of his name visible. Meanwhile, cell site analysis filled in the gaps. Police matched mobile data usage inside the flat to times when the suspect was off the street. The phone was active inside, silent when the man was out surveilling or carrying out the attack. It was a perfect digital match to the timeline captured on camera. Still, identifying the man behind the mask wasn't simple. He hadn't used a fake name to enter the country. He had flown into the UK under his real name, Anis Hemisi. But he'd kept a low profile. A professional kickboxer from Sweden, Hemesy had no criminal record. On paper, he looked like a tourist visiting during the festive season, but what stood out was his connection to Sweden's criminal landscape. Swedish and Danish authorities helped connect the dots. Hemesy was known to be close to figures involved in a long-running feud between rival drug gangs. His name came up in confidential intelligence reports, though until this moment, he had never been tied to violence. When police traced his movements, they found he had flown into London days before the killing. After the hit, he boarded a flight to Copenhagen, then travelled on to Thailand before returning to Sweden. He'd kept moving, hoping the trail would run cold. It didn't. On his return to Sweden, authorities arrested him and began extradition proceedings. He fought it hard. Every court hearing, every appeal was an attempt to stay out of the UK, but the evidence was too strong, and in 2021 he was sent back to face trial. The surveillance may have been silent, but it had seen everything. By the time Anis Hemesy was extradited to the UK in 2021, the Met had already built a near-complete picture of the murder plot. But this wasn't a one-man operation, and investigators knew it. The assassin had slipped into London with purpose. He had been supported, guided, and sheltered. Now, police wanted the rest of the web. The safe house in Oyster Wharf had been the starting point. Estevan Pino Munizaga had rented it under his own name just before Hemesy's arrival. A Swedish national with no previous convictions, Munizaga claimed to be unaware of what Hemesy had planned, but forensic evidence in the flat told a different story. Not only had he shared the space with the killer, but he had also helped set up the base used to plan and prepare for a brutal execution. He was arrested and charged with conspiracy to murder. Next came Clifford Rollocks and Claude Isaac, both based in London. Their involvement was more hands-on. Rollocks had helped Hemesy obtain the disguise, the high-vis jacket, gloves and mask. Isaac provided local knowledge, helped scout the area and supported Hemesy in staying under the radar. CCTV showed both men in the vicinity of the safe house and near the crime scene in the days before and after the hit. Each was arrested in coordinated raids and charged with assisting an offender, but the real complexity lay overseas. Tobias Andersson and Boa Karaya, both Swedish nationals, were suspected of organizing logistics from Sweden. Their digital fingerprints were traced through encrypted messages and phone records. The Crown Prosecution Service believed they'd played a key role in coordinating Hemesy's movements and liaising with others in London. Still, bringing them to trial proved more difficult. While British police believed the case was strong, a UK jury ultimately found insufficient evidence to convict them. Andersson and Karaya were acquitted of all charges. As the arrests mounted, a clearer image formed. This was not just a local crime. It was the product of a cross-border criminal enterprise, planned in Sweden, executed in London, and covered up across 3 countries. By early 2022, most of those involved were either behind bars or awaiting trial. The quiet street in Battersea had returned to normal. But beneath the surface, the investigation had sent shockwaves through international crime units, from the Met to Europol. And in the centre of it all stood the man in the mask, now finally facing the weight of justice. The courtroom at Suffolk Crown Court was packed when the verdict finally came. Journalists, detectives and family members of Flamma Bikiri sat in silence as the jury returned after weeks of testimony and evidence. At the centre of it all stood Anis Hemesy, former kickboxer, now convicted contract killer. He showed little emotion as the decision was read, guilty of murder. The trial had left little doubt. CCTV placed Hemesy near Bikiri's home in the days before the killing. Footage showed him dressed as a street cleaner, complete with high-vis jacket, latex mask, gloves, and even a litter picker. Residents recalled seeing him loitering in the area, sweeping streets that didn't need cleaning. One even challenged him. He calmly walked away. The disguise had been carefully chosen. So had the timing. Christmas Eve, when the streets were quieter and distractions were plenty, but it was the forensic trail that sealed the case. Gunshot residue on the bicycle, DNA on takeaway packaging in the flat. a torn plane ticket in the bin with Hemmesy's name still visible. Each detail told the same story. This wasn't a robbery. It was a targeted hit. The prosecution argued Hemesy had been sent by a criminal network linked to a long-standing feud between rival Scandinavian Albanian gangs. Flamma Bikiri, though known publicly as a music executive, had deep ties to the Petrovsky Group, a faction at odds with the Danish-based gang led by Amir Mehic. Bikiri was seen as a high-value target. His murder was a message. The defense did little to deny Hemesy's presence in London. They admitted he was the shooter, but painted him as a pawn, an athlete manipulated by more powerful criminals. A clean record, no previous involvement in violence, just a young man who got in too deep. But the jury didn't buy it. In February 2022, Hemesy was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 35 years. The judge called it a meticulously planned and cold-blooded assassination. For Bikiri's family, it was justice, but justice wrapped in heartbreak. Others involved, Munizaga, Rolex and Isaac, received lesser but still serious sentences. And as the trial closed, one question remained: if Hemesy was just the hitman, who gave the order? In the quiet early hours of Greater Manchester, a team of armed police closed in on a nondescript industrial estate. The lights were off, the shutters drawn, but behind one of those units, a multi-million-pound criminal empire was being dismantled, piece by piece. A voice crackled over a burner phone just days earlier. 5-0 busted the yard again. It was already too late. This was no ordinary car theft ring. It was an international chop shop operation run by career criminals, working under a sinister alias. The Company. Their targets weren't hatchbacks parked on dimly lit streets. They were going after luxury Range Rovers, Audis, BMWs and Porsches, many stolen in violent home invasions, or while victims slept upstairs. In some cases, families were threatened with hammers. In others, the thieves posed as airport valets or struck while people were out in their gardens. But this gang wasn't just selling cars. They were exporting parts to Dubai, laundering dirty money through fake companies, and even exploiting government COVID-19 relief schemes to fund their criminal enterprise. This is the story of how one of Britain's slickest, most ruthless car theft syndicates built a £3 million operation, and how it all fell apart under the weight of greed, arrogance, and a trail of stolen engines. They called themselves The Company, a fitting name for an organisation that ran like a business, except its profits came from crime. On the surface, they were car dealers, mechanics, exporters. But behind the shuttered units and fake invoices was a well-oiled criminal machine orchestrated by men who had no interest in playing by the rules. At the top of the hierarchy was Asif Hussain, the ringleader. He projected the image of a legitimate businessman. He lived in a large detached home in Stockport and operated German Automotive 365, a car garage with all the right paperwork on the surface. But the business was a front. Hussain wasn't just selling cars, he was stealing them, stripping them, and shipping them overseas. Then there was Sajid Jangir, his trusted lieutenant. Jangir wasn't just involved, he was embedded. Court records later showed he had a hand in at least 27 individual thefts. He was also the registered tenant for multiple industrial units where cars were disassembled and prepped for export. These weren't abandoned backstreet garages. They were fully operational chop shops, complete with heavy-duty lifts, forklifts, and teams of men ready to pull a car apart in hours. Alongside them were men like Hadir Ali, Tayyub Hussain, and Ibrahim Shafiq, each with their own role in the network. Ali helped move stolen parts. Tayyub was caught red-handed trying to launder stolen vehicles through a rental scam. And Shafiq, he did more than just dismantle cars. He used his fake company, Carbreakers Ltd, to obtain government COVID-19 bounce-back loans totaling £95,000. Money meant for struggling small businesses during the pandemic, instead funneled straight into a criminal empire. The gang was organised, disciplined, and paranoid. They communicated through WhatsApp groups with names like The Company, keeping discussions short and using code where possible. Still, police would later recover dozens of damning text and voice notes, jokes about raids, complaints about lost stock, and even shopping lists for parts they needed stolen. Their operation spanned Oldham, Bury, Bolton, and beyond. They targeted high-value vehicles, mostly Range Rovers, Porsches, and Audis, often stolen to order. Once taken, the cars would be rushed to one of their hidden units. Within hours, they'd be stripped for parts, boxed up, and prepared for shipping. The rest, engines, gearboxes, interiors, were either sold on or hidden in shipping containers bound for the Middle East. 11 containers were sent overseas during a 12-month period. 3 were intercepted, 1 at Seaforth Docks in Merseyside, another in Istanbul, and 1 in Sharjah, UAE. All contained stolen Range Rovers or parts linked to vehicles taken in the UK. This wasn't petty crime. It was a sprawling, calculated criminal enterprise worth millions. And the worst part? Some of these men had already been arrested during the investigation, but were released under police supervision. They didn't stop. They just moved shop, found new units, and kept going. Greed, arrogance, and a belief that they were untouchable kept them moving. But behind the scenes, detectives were closing in. The gang didn't just wait for cars to appear. They hunted them. Their targets were deliberate, their methods brutal. High-end vehicles weren't just stolen at random. They were often taken to order, with gang members scouting specific makes and models. Range Rovers, Audis, Porsches. If someone overseas wanted it, they'd find it, no matter where it was or who it belonged to. In one case, a man at home with his family in Failsworth was threatened by masked men who told him he'd be killed if he stepped outside. They took his Mercedes as he watched, helpless, clutching his young daughter. In another, a man out running errands was attacked in broad daylight, his car gone in seconds. There were break-ins, ambushes, and even a fake valet scam at Manchester Airport, where a victim handed over his car keys to a man in a high-vis jacket posing as staff. And this wasn't just Greater Manchester. Vehicles were taken from driveways in London, Cheshire, and Birmingham, sometimes while owners were asleep upstairs. In one incident, thieves entered a home while the family was in the garden, grabbed the keys, and vanished before anyone noticed. Another victim came home from holiday to find his car missing and his driveway eerily empty. Once a car was taken, it was immediately moved, often within an hour. GPS trackers were ripped out or jammed using signal blocking devices. The vehicle would then vanish into one of the gang's workshops, sometimes never to be seen in one piece again. The gang made no effort to cover the violence of their methods. One car was taken after its driver was forced off the road and attacked while inspecting the damage. Another was linked to a robbery where masked men, one armed with a hammer, stormed a house and snatched the keys in front of a terrified family. These were not chance encounters. They were coordinated, pre-planned thefts carried out with military precision. As they worked, the gang kept logs. Text message chains between members showed cars being scouted, followed, and listed for collection. Phrases like "fresh one" or "need this shape range" gave detectives insight into how vehicles were selected. They weren't just after anything valuable. They wanted specific models, fitted with the right tech, colours in demand abroad, and worth the effort of stripping or exporting. This level of planning wasn't just about profit, it was about scale. Between January 2020 and January 2021, the gang were linked to at least 90 vehicle thefts, totaling over £3 million in value. Some were dismantled in hours. Others, especially intact high-spec Range Rovers, were sealed in shipping containers and sent overseas, some ending up in Dubai, others stopped mid-route in Istanbul or Sharjah. For a gang as well organised as this one, you'd expect they would have covered their tracks. But for all their efforts to disappear into the shadows, the truth was, they left behind more than they realised. Detectives from Greater Manchester Police, alongside the serious and organised crime group, had been watching. Piece by piece, they began connecting the dots. It started small. A rented Audi A4 that had been loaned out by a dealership in Altrincham wasn't returned on time. The dealership had been told it was stuck in London, but the car's GPS told a different story. It was parked at an industrial unit in Chadderton. When police turned up to check, what they found changed the course of the investigation. Not only was the Audi inside, but it was surrounded by parts from at least 5 other stolen vehicles. The location had all the hallmarks of a chop shop: cars stripped for parts, frames cut down, identifying numbers ground off. That find set everything else in motion. The same suspects appeared again and again. Adam Elwood had rented the unit. His name would come up multiple times across several locations. The police now knew they weren't looking at isolated thefts. They were staring down the barrel of a far-reaching multi-million-pound conspiracy. What followed was a trail of broken promises and false names. After the Chadderton unit was uncovered, the group simply moved on. They used fake identities, like David Brown, to lease new industrial units in Wigan. It didn't take long for police to follow. Again, they tracked another stolen rental, a Mercedes-Benz, which had been reported stolen by one of the gang members themselves. But the car's tracker led officers straight to a new chop shop. There, they found Hyder Ali standing next to a running forklift, pretending to be waiting for a friend. As if that could explain the dismantled Range Rover parts and stolen engines all around him. One by one, the units were uncovered. Vale Mill in Chadderton, Pioneer Mill in Radcliffe, another in Bury. Each one held more stolen vehicles, more dismantled parts, and more evidence of a slick, ongoing operation. At Vale Mill, police discovered 17 stolen vehicles in one raid. Some were already stripped to nothing but chassis. Others were in the process of being broken down. One Audi RS3 had been violently stolen just hours before. When officers arrived, it was already in pieces. The gang knew they were under pressure. Text messages pulled from seized phones showed them planning to move out, switch tenancy names, and lay low. But their efforts were in vain. Police now had an entire digital trail: communications, GPS data, lease agreements, bank records, and photos. The members even joked in their encrypted group chat, 5-0 busted the yard again, as if police raids had become routine. But their sarcasm only helped investigators. Every message chipped away at their defense. In the end, it was the phones that betrayed them. Images, location pings, voice notes, and even shopping lists of car models to steal. This wasn't a loose network of thieves. This was a calculated, structured gang, stealing to order and cashing in fast. And the cops had the proof. Despite the gang's best efforts to stay hidden, it was only a matter of time before the machinery they built started creaking under its own weight. Too many moving parts, too many voices, and too much greed to keep things quiet forever. It all began to unravel from the inside out. The Audi A4 hired from a dealership in Altrincham was the first clue. The car was supposed to be in London, according to the gang. But a quick GPS check told a different story. It was parked outside an industrial unit in Chadderton. Police moved fast. Inside, they found not only the rented Audi, but parts from 5 other stolen vehicles. Chassis numbers had been ground off, plates removed, but the components told their own story. That's how the first yard was uncovered. Once that location was burned, the group pivoted. They moved into another unit, this time behind a quick-fit garage in Wigan, rented under the alias David Brown, a fake name they kept using over and over again. But the mistake was the same. A rented Mercedes was reported stolen by one of the gang members himself, trying to spin a lie that the car had vanished from his driveway. The vehicle's tracker told a different story, and once again, officers landed on a workshop filled with stolen engines and stripped Range Rovers. Then came the breakthrough. A dramatic raid on Vale Mill, a towering, hollowed-out industrial space in Chadderton, found a cache of parts from vehicles stolen across the country. Tracking data, CCTV, and dozens of text messages painted a full picture. This wasn't a loose crew doing the odd job. This was a business, a moving network of fake rentals, container bookings, forged invoices, burner phones, and storage units that were always one step ahead, until they weren't. Police began linking incidents through telecoms analysis and the mapping of stolen parts. A Porsche engine lifted from a burglary in Bolton was found next to a Range Rover transmission stolen in London. Containers full of stolen car parts were being loaded at shipping yards and labelled as industrial scrap or second-hand goods. One was stopped in Seaforth before it left for Dubai. Another was intercepted in Istanbul. A third made it all the way to Sharjah in the UAE before being ordered back unopened. What connected it all? A fake shipping firm, KG Logistics. On paper, it looked legitimate. In reality, it was a paper-thin cover for moving stolen UK vehicles overseas. The names used to rent units and order containers often belonged to cloned identities, real businesses that had no idea their information had been hijacked. Bank accounts opened under fake trading names received tens of thousands in unexplained funds, most of which disappeared as fast as it arrived. Meanwhile, the conspirators messaged each other through a WhatsApp group named The Company. In one thread, one of them laughed after a police raid, writing, "5-0 busted the yard again, get your jail kit ready." These weren't just thieves, they were veterans who knew how to run when the heat came, but also knew how to keep the machine turning until the very last minute. That bravado, that sense of untouchability, would be their downfall. Because by now, the cops weren't just chasing stolen cars. They were chasing a pattern, a syndicate, a criminal operation pretending to be a business. And this time, they weren't stopping at the gates. When the final pieces of the case were laid bare in court, the scale of the conspiracy stunned even experienced detectives. A slick, coordinated car theft and export operation that had stretched across Greater Manchester into the Midlands, London, and all the way to the Middle East. Over £3 million worth of stolen vehicles, 90 high-end cars, 11 shipping containers tracked, and in the end, a full roster of names standing trial. Asif Hussain, the gang's ringleader. He posed as a respectable businessman, ran a car sales firm, and lived in a detached home in Stockport. But behind that image was a man with 48 previous convictions, a former drug dealer, and a central figure in an international criminal racket. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to steal, handle stolen goods, export stolen vehicles, and commit fraud. The judge didn't hesitate, 15 years behind bars. Next was Hadir Ali, who had operated multiple chop shops, moved stolen engines, and used fake identities to cover his tracks. His reward? 11 years in prison. Sajid Jangaria of Bolton was jailed for 10 years, having been linked to dozens of vehicle thefts and fraud offences. He helped coordinate logistics, played a hands-on role at the sites, and even filmed target vehicles during drive-bys. Tayyib Hussain, a key player in the vehicle handling and parts distribution, got 5 years and 6 months. Ibas Shafiq, the man behind some of the gang's financial operations, was handed 5 years. He helped move cash between accounts, laundered proceeds, and, in one of the most shocking turns, successfully applied for 2 government COVID bounce-back loans totaling £95,000. He claimed the money using fake company details and funneled it into personal accounts. His business never filed a tax return. Never existed. The fraud didn't stop there, as if Hussain himself had received a £50,000 bounce-back loan. Despite his criminal history, he was approved without checks. The court heard how the system meant to support struggling UK businesses during a crisis was manipulated by men running a £1 million theft ring. The judge called it moral depravity of the highest order. More convictions followed. Asif Mashat, 3 years, 6 months. Shaz Rahman, 4 years, 9 months. Imran Taj, 4 years. Zishan Ali, 3 years, 9 months. Adam Elwood, 6 years for handling stolen goods and drug offences. Mohammed Imran, 3 years. All told, over 25 people were convicted. More than £1.7 million in cash flowed through their accounts, and untold sums were never recovered. Police believe the gang operated undetected for years, exploiting the chaos of the pandemic and weaknesses in vehicle security systems to build a thriving criminal empire. But this wasn't just a case about stolen cars. It exposed deep issues in policing, government oversight, and public safety. The judge was blunt. Too many of the gang had been previously arrested, only to be released under investigation. Background checks weren't made, cases weren't escalated. In his words, some victims may have been spared trauma if action had been taken sooner. What does all this say? That serious, organised crime doesn't always look like TV dramas. Sometimes it hides behind car lots, garages, and WhatsApp groups with names like The Company. Sometimes it wears designer clothes and signs bank forms with forged names. And sometimes it robs people while they sleep, while they're on holiday, or while they're just trying to park at an airport. These weren't kids stealing for fun. They were professionals, calculating, unapologetic. The long sentences delivered were more than just numbers. They were a warning to others running similar operations, to those who think they can hide in plain sight, and to the systems that allowed it all to happen in the first place. Because for every engine stripped and every keyless car gone in 60 seconds, there were families left afraid, businesses devastated, and a country waking up to the reality that crime, real organized crime, doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs a system too slow to catch up. And this time, the system caught up. Barely. The moment police move in to arrest Armin and Florian as they were trying to retrieve a massive drug import. In the spring of 2022, a shipping container arrived at London Gateway Port carrying crates of bananas from Ecuador. But this wasn't just a routine food import. Hidden in the roof of the container, expertly concealed, were 139 kilograms of high-purity cocaine worth an estimated £11 million on the UK streets. The shipment was the centerpiece of a carefully planned drug smuggling plot led by Sajid Ali, a man living in Turkey but orchestrating everything through encrypted messages and trusted middlemen on British soil. Ali was no street-level dealer. He was the architect of a large-scale trafficking network that aimed to move vast quantities of drugs from South America into the UK. The cocaine, linked to a South American cartel, was meant to be the first of many such shipments. But the plan didn't unfold as expected. Unbeknown to the gang, UK authorities had already intercepted the shipment, removed the cocaine, and resealed the container with dummy packages. As Ali's associates prepared to collect their prize, officers from the National Crime Agency moved in. What followed was a series of arrests, trials, and prison sentences that would dismantle a dangerous international criminal operation, one that had aimed to flood British streets with cocaine hidden in plain sight. Sajid Ali wasn't the kind of man to get his hands dirty. Based in Turkey, he kept himself far from the physical risk of the drug trade, but he was deeply involved in its organization. From his base overseas, Ali pulled the strings of a complex smuggling operation. He communicated through WhatsApp, using voice notes and messages to direct his team in the UK. He rarely appeared in person, but his presence was constant, felt in every decision, every order, every step of the plan. Ali was no amateur. He understood the risks and worked to keep his name off the front lines. His strategy was clear: use trusted lieutenants to handle operations in the UK while he managed logistics from afar. This included choosing the smuggling method, coordinating transport, and timing the collection of the drugs. The plan, at least in theory, was well thought out. At the centre of Ali's UK team were two key men, Merchant Shahu and Robert Bull. Both operated under his instruction, acting as the local contacts who would manage the final phase of the drug delivery. Their job was to monitor the container once it reached the UK, collect it from the port, and ensure the drugs were successfully extracted and handed over. Ali's plan centered around a single container packed with banana. The gang had no reason to suspect the shipment was compromised, but by the time it arrived in the UK, the National Crime Agency, NCA, and Border Force were already one step ahead. Acting on intelligence, officers had inspected the container as soon as it arrived. They discovered the cocaine hidden in the roof section, removed every package, and resealed the unit with dummies. The aim was simple: let the gang carry on as planned and catch them in the act. As the container sat at the port, Ali waited in Turkey for updates. Ball and Shahu sent him photos of the shipment and arranged for it to be moved to a storage facility in Warwickshire. The gang believed everything was going smoothly. Ali, confident in his team, made preparations to return to the UK and tie up loose ends. But what he didn't know was that every move was being tracked, every message noted, and the entire plan was already crumbling. By keeping himself physically distant, Ali hoped to stay above suspicion, but in the end, the very technology he used to stay invisible would become key evidence against him. His voice notes, texts, and planning were all recorded. For Sajid Ali and his team, this was supposed to be a smooth run. The shipment was timed perfectly. The container arrived unnoticed, and the gang believed it was just days away from payout. But the National Crime Agency and Border Force had already made their move. Acting on intelligence, officers intercepted the container upon arrival. Inside, they discovered the cocaine stashed with precision, compressed into bricks, wrapped tightly, and tucked into concealed compartments. It was a professional job, clearly the work of an experienced cartel, but the UK end was now under watch. Authorities replaced the drugs with dummy packages and resealed the container, allowing it to continue on its journey. Robert Ball, Ali's UK-based contact, had no idea the swap had taken place. He arranged for a transport company to collect the container from the port. Along with Merchant Shahu, he had it moved to a storage yard in Warwickshire. Surveillance teams tracked every movement, documenting the handover, the route, and the final destination. On April 15th, 2022, Ball and Shahu met at a Costa Coffee in Kings Heath, Birmingham. There, they finalized their plans and received last-minute instructions. Sajid Ali, still directing operations from afar, remained in constant contact. Later that day, Ball and Shahu arrived at the storage yard alongside two other men, Florijan Ibra and Arman Kavani. Border Force officers, acting on intelligence, had flagged the container as suspicious before it ever left the port. Working in partnership with the National Crime Agency, NCA, officers moved in while the container sat in a secure area. What they found confirmed their suspicions. Hundreds of blocks of cocaine carefully stashed in the overhead cavity. The estimated street value, over £11 million. Rather than seize the load immediately, investigators saw an opportunity to do something far more effective. In one of the most crucial moves of the operation, officers carefully removed the cocaine and replaced it with the dummy packages, identical in size and shape, but containing harmless material. Once the switch was complete, the container was resealed and released, just as if nothing had happened. It was now under surveillance, part of a controlled delivery that would help expose the gang from top to bottom. What followed was a logistical chess game. One of the gang's key players, Robert Ball, contacted the shipping company to release not just one, but 4 containers, likely a tactic to avoid drawing attention to a single high-value target. But the authorities were watching. Surveillance teams tracked the containers as they were transported to a commercial storage site in Crayford, southeast London. Meanwhile, messages were flying. Sajid Ali, the gang's ringleader, wasn't anywhere near the container. He remained in Birmingham, keeping his hands clean and communicating through WhatsApp voice notes. His lieutenants, Ball and co-conspirator Merchant Shahu, were on the ground. Ball sent images of the container once it reached the storage site, keeping Ali informed every step of the way. To the gang, everything seemed to be running smoothly. They had no idea that the real drugs had already been seized, or that the container was being monitored around the clock. The dummies inside were bait, and the trap was already set. The gang believed they were just hours away from striking gold. In reality, they were marching straight into the hands of armed officers. The group wasted no time. Using a crowbar and a forklift truck, Ibra and Kavani climbed onto the container and began tearing open the roof. They believed they were about to retrieve the multi-million-pound shipment of cocaine hidden just beneath the surface. Instead, they were met with decoys, but they didn't get far enough to realize. As the roof was opened, NCA and police officers swarmed the site. It was a perfectly timed operation. Ibra and Kavani tried to run but were quickly caught. Ball and Shahu were arrested on the spot. The warehouse was secured, the vehicle impounded, and the entire gang taken into custody. Months of planning had collapsed in a matter of minutes. In their minds, this was meant to be a clean job, quick in, quick out, and a huge payday. But the operation had been compromised from the moment the container landed. The authorities had chosen not to strike early. They wanted the full picture, not just the street-level players, but the decision-makers, the organizers, and ultimately, the man giving orders from abroad. The raid didn't just seize a dummy shipment, it exposed a fully structured operation, one built on confidence, timing, and the belief that nobody was watching. But someone had been watching all along. And the banana boxes, meant to mask a fortune in drugs, had turned into the very thing that brought the entire network down. When officers moved in on the container in Warwickshire, Sajid Ali was nowhere near the scene. He was in Turkey, living comfortably in Istanbul, far from the chaos unfolding back in the UK. That distance wasn't accidental, it was by design. Ali didn't carry packages, he didn't drive the lorries or cut open containers. Instead, he operated from the sidelines, directing every step through voice notes and texts. The men arrested on site that day, Ball, Shahu, Ibra, and Kavani, were following his instructions. And while they'd been caught red-handed, Ali still believed he could stay out of reach. From the beginning, Ali positioned himself as untouchable. He stayed away from direct involvement, rarely using traceable methods of communication. When he did reach out, it was through encrypted apps or burner phones. But even his attempts to hide weren't enough. The National Crime Agency had already identified his voice, matched his digital footprints, and linked him to conversations with both Ball and Shahu. Surveillance, phone data, and chat logs painted a clear picture. Sajid Ali wasn't a bystander. He was the architect. Ali had built his network slowly. He knew the right people, understood the risks, and kept his hands clean. But what gave him away was his control. Voice messages recovered from his devices showed him giving precise instructions: where to collect, how to unload, who to trust. Images of the container sent to his phone were timestamped and traced. He wasn't just kept in the loop, he was calling the shots. Even the meeting at Costa Coffee, where Ball and Shahu finalized plans just hours before the arrest, had been arranged under his direction. Investigators believe Ali's decision to base himself abroad was an attempt to avoid being connected to any physical location in the UK. He had done enough to appear distant, but not enough to disappear. Eventually, the evidence was overwhelming. After months of tracking his movements, the NCA moved to detain Ali. He was arrested at Heathrow Airport in early 2024, just minutes before boarding another flight back to Turkey. The timing was deliberate. He had spent only a short window in the UK, possibly to touch base or deal with fallout from the failed shipment. Either way, the authorities didn't let him leave again. Back on UK soil, Ali refused to cooperate. He denied involvement, claiming he had nothing to do with the drugs or the container. But the case against him was already solid. Digital evidence showed a clear chain of command, with Ali at the top. His co-defendants had been convicted months earlier, and now it was his turn to face trial. With the Warwickshire sting completed and 4 gang members in custody, attention turned to the man who had managed to avoid getting his hands dirty, Sajid Ali. While his associates were busy cracking open the container, Ali was more than 1,500 miles away, planning his escape. But his role in the conspiracy had already been uncovered. Ali had used voice notes and text messages on WhatsApp to direct the entire operation. He kept his communication clear and limited, avoiding unnecessary details and avoiding the scene itself. But the digital trail betrayed him. His instructions to Ball and Shahu were found on their phones. Images, location updates, and audio recordings linked him to each stage of the plan. The NCA didn't need to catch him red-handed. They had the evidence already. In interviews, Ali denied everything. He claimed he was traveling for personal reasons. He insisted the voice notes weren't related to drugs. He said he didn't know the container contained cocaine. But the weight of the evidence left little room for doubt. His own communications had placed him at the top of the chain. He had coordinated the pickup, he had reviewed the container's location, and he had arranged meetings with the very men caught prying open the roof. As the case moved forward, prosecutors painted a clear picture. Ali wasn't a courier or a middleman. He was the decision maker, a man working quietly behind the scenes, using technology and trusted contacts to try and move an enormous volume of Class A drugs into the UK. The rest of the gang had already been dealt with. At Warwick Crown Court, Ball, Shahu, Ibra and Cavani were sentenced to a total of 62 years for their part in the conspiracy. They were caught in the act, caught on camera, and caught by their own phones. But Ali's fate would be left to another jury. That jury, sitting at Isleworth Crown Court, took less than 3 weeks to reach a verdict. The evidence had been laid out in methodical detail: the messages, the meetings, the planning. Ali was found guilty of conspiracy to import Class A drugs, despite his efforts to distance himself from the crime. His leadership, while remote, had been central to the entire operation. When the verdict came in, it was more than just a conviction. It was a confirmation that the man calling the shots could still be held to account, even if he never physically touched a single package. In modern drug trafficking, hierarchy doesn't always look like a chain of command. Sometimes it looks like voice notes sent from a hotel room, but the law doesn't care where the orders come from. Ali was going to prison, and his empire of bananas and cocaine had finally collapsed. With the verdict delivered, the final step was sentencing. For Sajid Ali and the men who followed his instructions, it would be a reckoning that reflected both the scale of the operation and the danger it posed to society. Ali stood before Isleworth Crown Court in March 2025 to learn his fate. He'd been found guilty of orchestrating the smuggling of 139 kilograms of high-purity cocaine, a haul valued at more than £11 million on the streets. Though he hadn't been physically present at the storage yard when the arrest happened, the court had no doubt he was the one pulling the strings. The judge described Ali's role as pivotal. This wasn't a man caught up in a moment of desperation. He was deliberate, organized, and strategic. His communications showed a clear intent to traffic drugs at an industrial level. He'd coordinated logistics, arranged meetings, and kept himself just far enough removed to avoid the fallout until the authorities caught up. For his leadership and planning, Sajid Ali was sentenced to 11 years in prison. It was a significant term, but many observers noted that the damage caused by such a large-scale importation could ripple far beyond the prison gates. This wasn't just about profit. Cocaine trafficking feeds violence, fuels gang activity, and devastates communities. The judge made that clear in his final remarks. This was not just a financial crime. It had the potential to cause immense harm on the streets of the UK. Ali's associates had already learned their fates in earlier hearings. Robert Ball, the man who organised transport and liaised directly with the Albanian gang, received 16 years. Merchant Shahu, who helped coordinate the container extraction and sent updates back to Ali, was jailed for 14 years. The two men who physically tore into the container, Florijan Ibra and Arman Cavani, received 17 and 15 years respectively. In total, the gang sentences added up to over 70 years in custody. The National Crime Agency hailed the case as a major win against organised crime. The seizure had not only stopped a vast quantity of cocaine from reaching the streets, but also disrupted a pipeline of drugs that stretched from South America to the heart of Birmingham. The CPS echoed those sentiments, saying the conviction sent a clear message to traffickers that they would be held accountable no matter how carefully they tried to hide. But for others watching, there was a lingering sense that the story wasn't over. The Albanian gang behind the shipment remained unnamed and untouched, at least for now, and Sajid Ali, for all his orchestration, was just one cog in a much larger machine. Still, justice had been served in this case. The fake fruit consignment, the Costa Coffee meetups, the voice notes, all of it had led to long prison terms for those involved. It was a rare moment when a high-level figure in the drug trade had been not only identified but removed from circulation. And in the world Ali came from, that doesn't happen often enough. On paper, Alex Mail was just another man from Weston-super-Mare. But behind the scenes, he was moving kilos of cocaine, laundering money, and arranging deals with some of the UK's most organised criminals. His tool of choice? Not a gun, not a gang, but an encrypted phone and the belief that nobody was watching. For a while, he was right. Using EncroChat, the now infamous encrypted messaging system, Mail operated like a ghost. He didn't just deal, he coordinated. Police believe he oversaw a network of distributors across the southwest, buying in bulk and shipping drugs in quantities that could bankroll a luxury lifestyle. But when EncroChat was cracked in 2020 as part of Operation Venetic, his digital shield shattered. Arrests followed. So did headlines. But by then, Alex Mail had vanished. He spent years on the run, slipping through borders, changing names and living off-grid. Then, in 2022, a forged passport and a misstep at Lisbon Airport brought him down. Or so it seemed. This is the story of Alex Mail. From encrypted empire to Interpol's most wanted list. From a Turkish layover to a Portuguese legal loophole that left British police empty-handed. A story of tech, timing, and a man who thought he was untouchable. Weston-super-Mare isn't known for high-level drug dealers. It's a sleepy seaside town, retirees, beach huts, chip shops. But beneath the surface, something else was moving. Alex Mail was one of the first to shift it. He didn't start out flashy. No big cars, no Rolex, just connections, quiet ones. By his mid-20s, Mail had turned into a regional player. Not a street dealer, but someone organising the ones who were. Cocaine, ketamine, cannabis. Western England's network was small, but lucrative, and Mail was building a name in it. What changed everything was tech, specifically EncroChat. By 2019, encrypted phones weren't just a luxury for big-time gangsters. They were the go-to tool for anyone serious. EncroChat offered end-to-end secrecy. No names, no tracking, no worries. Or so it seemed. Mail embraced it. His operation grew. According to the National Crime Agency, he became a key distributor, ordering large kilos, assigning drops, coordinating with other crews across the southwest. He wasn't just selling drugs, he was managing people who sold for him. The phone became his HQ, messages, codes, orders, all sent under the belief that no one could hear. But the system he trusted would be the same one that exposed him. By 2020, Mail had been arrested, but then skipped bail, fled the country, vanished. For the next 4 years, he lived as a shadow, only ever a few moves ahead of the system he once outsmarted. But his name never left the list. Not for the NCA, not for Interpol, not for the families hit hardest by the drug trade he helped flood across the southwest. He thought he was untouchable. That tech and travel would keep him safe. What he didn't count on was Lisbon. For years, the UK's top criminals thought they'd cracked it. Privacy, at last. EncroChat was sold as unbreakable. No SIM records, self-wiping messages. Anonymity by design. But in 2020, that illusion collapsed overnight. What they didn't know was that French and Dutch investigators had hacked the entire system. Quietly, methodically. Every message, location ping and contact, from dealers, suppliers, gun runners, fed into real-time servers. Across Europe, law enforcement watched criminal networks expose themselves one message at a time. They called it Operation Venetic. In the UK, it was the largest digital surveillance operation ever run. Thousands of names surfaced, hundreds of operations launched. One of them, Alex Mail. Mail was linked to an EncroChat handle coordinating the supply of multiple kilos of cocaine and ketamine. His phone, his trusted tool, was now evidence. Investigators believed he wasn't just buying to sell. He was overseeing multiple distributors, giving orders, setting prices, discussing money laundering and the potential purchase of a firearm. But as the first arrests were made in 2020, Mail vanished. He skipped bail in December that year, shortly after being picked up by the Southwest Regional Organised Crime Unit. By the time the EncroChat revelations were starting to build cases across the country, Mail was already on the move. Some say he went to Spain, others believe Morocco. But what's clear is that he knew the walls were closing in, and bolted before they did. Still, his name stayed hot. A warrant went out. Interpol listed him. In January 2022, he was added to the NCA's Most Wanted. His mugshot was released, his tattoos detailed, a skull on the throat, tribal ink running down both arms, distinctive, and still missing. Authorities described him as a key regional distributor, one of the Southwest's main links to wholesale drugs. He wasn't a foot soldier, he was infrastructure. And Operation Venetic wasn't done. Over 1,300 people would eventually be charged based on EncroChat evidence. 260 convicted, £75 million in cash seized, firearms recovered. But for all its success, Venetic had a weakness. Most of its charges hinged on one thing: EncroChat evidence. And as challenges started rising in European courts about how that evidence was collected, cases began to wobble. Alex Mail wasn't just dodging prison, he was betting that by the time they caught him, the evidence might not hold up. When Alex Mail vanished in late 2020, he didn't just disappear, he adapted. Like so many fugitives with resources and contacts, he didn't need to hide in the shadows. He needed to blend in, move quietly, and stay ahead of the paperwork. His first stop? Likely Spain, specifically the southern coast, Costa del Sol, Marbella, San Pedro, and other enclaves where British expats, criminals, and cartel affiliates mingle with ease. Mail had contacts, he had cash, and more importantly, he had time. From there, he kept moving. One report placed him in Morocco. Another suggested he was switching identities, using forged documents to move freely through Schengen borders. The same skills that helped him run a regional drug network were now focused on staying out of reach. Fake passports, burner phones, a low profile in public, but just active enough in criminal circles to survive. Interpol flagged him. The National Crime Agency named him one of the UK's most wanted. His name appeared on billboards in Spain as part of a Europol campaign, but nothing stuck. And while on the run, Mail didn't just lie low, he allegedly stayed involved. Authorities believe he continued managing some aspects of his network from abroad, leveraging encrypted platforms and trusted contacts to keep cash and commodities moving. He was no longer just a drug dealer. He was an international fugitive managing risk in real time. The longer he stayed gone, the more confident he seemed to get. Friends say he thought he'd outrun it, that if the UK courts couldn't extradite quickly, the case might fade. Others say he never believed the Enquirer evidence would hold, not in the long run, not with so many legal questions swirling around its collection. But staying out means staying perfect, and all it takes is one mistake. That moment came in April 2022. A flight, a passport, a name that didn't quite match. After more than a year as a ghost, Alex Mail resurfaced. Not because he wanted to, but because a passport control officer in Turkey raised an eyebrow. The forged document didn't clear. He was refused entry. He turned around, boarded a flight to Lisbon, and walked straight into Portuguese authorities. The escape had lasted 16 months. Now, for the first time, Alex Mail was in handcuffs. April 30th, 2022, Lisbon Airport. Alex Mail steps off a flight from Istanbul. He's got a forged passport, a fake name, and a quiet confidence that's been building over months on the run. He's done this before. Airports, border checks, false identities. But this time, it doesn't work. The passport triggers a red flag, not just any alert, Interpol. Portuguese border police pull him aside. They take fingerprints, check biometrics, run the data. It doesn't take long. The man in front of them is one of Britain's most wanted fugitives, accused drug trafficker, alleged money launderer, suspected of using Enquirer to direct a major UK drug network. It's all there in the system. He's arrested on the spot. The news makes headlines within hours. The NCA celebrates. Another fugitive caught. Another name ticked off the Operation Venetic list. They say Alex Mail thought he was smarter than the system, that he believed he could move across borders undetected. And for a while, he did. But now, he's in a Lisbon holding cell. The arrest is a win. Mail had slipped through the cracks once already, back in 2020 when he skipped bail and vanished. This time, the agencies involved move fast. The UK prepares an extradition request. The paperwork is sent. The wheels of justice turn. At first, it looks like a formality. The UK and Portugal have an extradition agreement. Mail is in custody. The charges are serious: conspiracy to supply cocaine and ketamine, money laundering, and conspiracy to acquire a firearm. No minor offences, no technicality play. But nothing is ever that simple. In the background, his legal team moves just as quickly. They file for habeas corpus, a legal process to challenge his detention. It's a pressure tactic, one that banks on delays, missed paperwork, or legal grey areas. And in this case, it works. While the extradition request is still being processed, the clock runs out. Portuguese law imposes a strict custody time limit for uncharged suspects. That deadline passes. And on October 15th, 2022, just over 5 months after his arrest, Alex Mail walks free. No charges filed, no bail required, released from custody on a legal technicality. For the NCA, it's a nightmare. The arrest they celebrated is now unravelling in real time. The man they called one of the UK's most wanted is no longer in custody. He's not even under house arrest. He's gone. And this time, the system didn't catch him. It let him go. By the time Alex Mail stepped out of custody in Portugal, the UK's National Crime Agency had already started bracing for damage control. What was meant to be a clean handover, arrest, extradition, conviction, had turned into a diplomatic and legal mess. And the worst part, it wasn't a loophole that let him go, it was the rules. Under Portuguese law, a suspect held without formal charges must be released after a fixed custody limit. That time ran out before the UK's extradition paperwork could push through the courts. His legal team filed a habeas corpus application, and a Portuguese Supreme Court judge ruled in his favour. No bail, no house arrest, just walk out. It wasn't about whether he was guilty. It wasn't even about the charges. It was about time and bureaucracy. The NCA called it frustrating. Privately, it was more than that. This was the same agency that had proudly added Mail to its most wanted list just months earlier. His arrest in Lisbon had been a PR win, but now he wasn't just a fugitive again. He was a fugitive who had embarrassed them twice. What made it worse was the silence. The UK didn't issue a public update. No warning to say the suspect they'd trumpeted was now back on the loose. No details about how the extradition stalled. It was journalists who found out first. Not law enforcement. Some legal experts pointed fingers at the UK. If the extradition request had been submitted sooner or with tighter documentation, the result might have been different. But others highlighted the deeper issue. International extradition laws vary wildly and move slowly. And in a system obsessed with process, speed isn't guaranteed. The Portuguese court never said Mael was innocent. It didn't rule on the strength of the EncroChat evidence. It simply said, if you haven't charged him, you can't hold him. And just like that, one of the UK's biggest post-EncroChat arrests turned into a cautionary tale. For Mael, it meant another chance to vanish. For the agencies chasing him, it meant starting over, again. And for the public watching from the sidelines, it raised a question no one seemed ready to answer. How do you lose the same man twice? After his surprise release by Portuguese authorities in late 2022, Alex Mael vanished once again. No bail conditions, no ankle tag, just a fugitive with money, connections, and time to plan his next move. For months, the trail went cold. He was off the radar, no confirmed sightings, no fresh data hits. The embarrassment for the NCA was public, but behind closed doors, surveillance teams quietly ramped up again. Mael didn't return to the UK. Instead, he is believed to have moved through Spain and North Africa, using forged passports and trusted intermediaries to stay one step ahead. Sources later confirmed he spent time in Morocco, where criminal networks offered both shelter and new opportunities. But the pressure never let up. His image was circulated among European law enforcement, flagged at every airport, border, and checkpoint. In early 2024, after nearly a year and a half on the run, Mael slipped up again. This time, it wasn't a forged passport. It was a financial transaction that triggered interest. A flagged wire transfer led to renewed surveillance. Weeks later, he was spotted near Marbella, Spain. On his way to a meeting, a joint UK-Spanish task force moved in. No chase, no drama. Alex Mael was finally back in custody. In April 2024, nearly 2 years after slipping through the fingers of Portuguese authorities, Alex Mael finally stood in a UK courtroom. The man once branded Britain's most wanted was no longer in the wind. He was in the dock. Extradited back from Portugal under quieter circumstances in late 2023, after months of renewed negotiation, Mael now faced the charges he had once run from: conspiracy to supply cocaine and ketamine, money laundering, and conspiracy to acquire a firearm. His case was built on evidence gathered from EncroChat, part of Operation Venetic, Britain's largest digital takedown of organised crime. Prosecutors claimed Mael wasn't just dealing, he was directing. A regional controller managing kilos of Class A drugs using encrypted devices to coordinate with suppliers and distributors across Europe. Mael eventually pleaded guilty, with defense lawyers arguing that the pressure of being a fugitive had forced him into surrender. The court, however, focused not on his flight, but on the scale of his operation and the trust he commanded in criminal networks. In December 2024, at Bristol Crown Court, Alex Mael was sentenced to 18 years in prison. The judge called him an orchestrator, not a foot soldier, a man who ran a business that thrived on addiction, secrecy, and fear. The courtroom was packed. The NCA had their win, albeit a delayed one. Officers released a statement welcoming the sentence, calling it proof that fugitives will always be pursued, no matter how long it takes. But some questions still linger. Would the case have stood without EncroChat? Would he have served time if Portugal hadn't eventually relented? And how many others like him are still out there, living quietly behind fake names and forged documents? Alex Mael's empire may have crumbled, but the game hasn't stopped. It just moves on. This time, justice caught up. But next time, will it be fast enough? When the EncroChat network was cracked back in 2020, it was hailed as a revolution in digital policing. For years, encrypted phones had given drug bosses and hitmen what they thought was total security. But with one stroke, thanks to a secret French-Dutch operation, the wall came crashing down. Thousands of suspects, millions of messages. It was, according to the NCA, the most significant blow to organized crime in a generation. But by 2024, cracks had started to show, not in the messages, but in the prosecutions. In France, the country that led the hacking operation, its own Supreme Court made a ruling that sent shockwaves through Europe's justice systems. It found that prosecutors failed to provide a crucial certificate, an authentication of the data gathered through the hack. Without it, the court said, there was no way to verify that the evidence hadn't been tampered with. Worse, it questioned the legality of the data sharing with other countries, like the UK. For the National Crime Agency, that posed a massive problem. Much of their case against Alex Mail and hundreds of others rests on that same EncroChat data. If courts in Europe start doubting its legality, how long before UK cases begin to unravel too? Already, defense lawyers are circling. Some point out that the NCA still hasn't revealed exactly how it received and handled the data. Others argue that privacy rights were trampled in the process. And then, there's the fact that many suspects were charged based solely on digital messages. No drugs in hand, no cash, no weapons. Just words on a screen. It's a legal minefield. On one side, you have police forces who say the data proves conspiracy and control over massive drug networks. On the other, defense teams who argue it's vague, unverifiable, and in some cases, illegally obtained. The implications for Alex Mail are direct. If the EncroChat data is thrown out, the case against him weakens. That might explain why Portugal hesitated. If the foundation of the evidence is unstable, why rush extradition? EncroChat once looked like a masterstroke. But as time passes, what was once solid ground now feels like sand. And for every drug kingpin that's already been jailed, there are dozens, maybe hundreds, still waiting for trial. If the courts start pulling threads, the whole operation could unravel. And fugitives like Mail, they'll be watching every moment. It happened in Mayfair, one of the richest spots in London. Expensive watches, big money, people walking around without a care in the world. But on October 10th, 2024, someone was watching, and someone was ready to strike. A man in a dark jacket walks up behind a woman. He grabs her wrist and pulls. In one quick move, he's got the watch and he's running. It's all caught on CCTV. But what he doesn't know, the woman he just robbed is a police officer. And the watch? A fake, planted to catch him. Seconds later, it's chaos. Plainclothes officers rush in from every side. One of them slips as he gives chase. Two men are caught right away. The one who ran, he's tracked down later. The trap worked. The gang took the bait. For weeks, police had been tracking a group who targeted people wearing expensive watches, mostly in central London. Rolexes, Patek Philippe's, Richard Mile's, anything that looked like money. They worked fast, usually in teams and always in the busiest places. The Met decided to turn the tables, so they sent in a team dressed like the kind of people the gang usually picked out. What happened next shut down one of the boldest robbery crews London has seen in years. They were after a £50,000 watch. But they walked straight into a police operation. This is the story of the Rolex Ripper Gang and how they got played at their own game. They weren't unknown to police. Jacob Harkett had already been involved in multiple thefts. Mohammed Naz was often seen alongside him. Janice Amiri and Adel Mohammed, both with histories of violent robbery, were part of the same circle. Together, they formed a crew that targeted the wealthiest parts of London, moving between Mayfair, Knightsbridge and Chelsea, always watching wrists, not wallets. Their aim was simple: high-value watches. Rolex, Patek Philippe, Richard Mille. They weren't interested in phones or bags. They wanted timepieces worth tens or hundreds of thousands. The type of item that could be sold quickly on the black market, sometimes within hours. This wasn't smash and grab. The group worked in teams. One would follow the target, another would get close. The third would strike. A fourth was often waiting nearby to create confusion or help with the getaway. They walked the same streets as their victims, dressed to blend in. Hooded jackets, designer trainers, phones in hand. But they weren't browsing shops. They were scouting wrists. In some cases, victims were distracted with questions. In others, they were simply grabbed, twisted, and forced to let go of what was on their wrist. One method involved wrapping a hand around the victim's arm, turning it quickly, and unclipping the watch before they had time to react. The entire thing could take under 10 seconds. CCTV later showed how quick the moves were, how normal it looked until it was already over. The Met Police had been tracking this pattern for months. There had been a sharp rise in luxury watch thefts, especially between July and October 2024. Many happened in daylight. Most followed the same pattern. A pair or trio of young men targeting someone leaving a bar, restaurant, or hotel. Victims were often wealthy tourists or business owners. Some were walking with friends, others were alone. It didn't matter. If you had a £100,000 watch on your wrist, you were a target. Harkett and Nas were linked to multiple incidents, but police lacked the final proof. Witnesses rarely saw faces. Victims were often too shocked to remember details. And when arrests were made, there was never enough to secure convictions. That changed on October 10th. After weeks of preparation, officers launched a sting. Undercover operatives would pose as a wealthy couple, wearing designer clothes and a replica rose gold Patek Philippe. The team hoped the bait would attract the right kind of attention. The gang took it. In one moment, the operation went from theory to reality. Harkett lunged, grabbed the watch, and tried to run. But the area was filled with plainclothes officers. What followed would bring the case to a turning point and expose the full scale of the gang's activity. By then, it was no longer about a single watch. It was about a team that had slipped through the system too many times. This time, they didn't. On the evening of October 10th, 2024, central London looked exactly as it always did. Busy, well-dressed, expensive. But behind the storefronts and luxury cars, plainclothes officers were in place. The targets were known. The trap was set. The operation centered on Berkeley Square, a hotspot for high-end robbery. Undercover officers, posing as a wealthy couple, walked slowly through the area. The woman wore a replica Patek Philippe rose gold watch. Her partner dressed the part too, tailored suit, confidence, and no hint of caution. They weren't bait in theory. They were bait in reality. Close by, surveillance teams were stationed in unmarked vehicles and on foot, waiting. Jacob Harkett spotted the pair first. Then came Mohammed Nas, flanked by the rest of the crew. They didn't hesitate. They followed, closing in as the officers turned into a side street. CCTV footage would later show the exact moment. Harkett reaching out, grabbing the watch, and yanking it clean off the woman's wrist. He didn't know what he'd just done. Almost immediately, the area came alive. Officers swarmed the scene. A plainclothes officer tackled Nas. Another moved for Mohammed. Harkett ran, bolting from the scene with speed that suggested experience, but he didn't get far. He was picked up shortly after by backup units already in pursuit. The footage didn't just capture the robbery, it showed the reaction. One officer slipped as he charged across the pavement. Another civilian froze as the chaos unfolded. For bystanders, it looked sudden, but every second had been planned. The fake Patek had dropped during the struggle. It was recovered at the scene, undamaged. The message was clear. They weren't just catching thieves, they were collecting proof. Harkett was taken into custody and admitted to robbery within days. Nas, who'd claimed during questioning that he'd simply been out for coffee and cigarettes, denied everything. The excuse didn't hold. Phone records, movement data, and surveillance placed him directly at the scene, in sync with the others. Worse still, his device showed recent internet searches for ultra-luxury watches. It was premeditated. Meanwhile, two other men, Janice Amiri and Adel Mohammed, were nowhere to be found. Both had fled, failing to appear at court dates. Arrest warrants were issued immediately, but their role in the robbery was already documented. CCTV showed them near the victim, watching, moving as a group, and reacting as the crime unfolded. The sting worked. The timing, the pressure, the setup, it all came together. The team moved in with seconds to spare. They'd turned a quiet October evening in Mayfair into the closing chapter of a long investigation. The Rolex rippers thought they'd found another mark. Instead, they walked straight into the arms of the police. After the arrests, the focus shifted. The robbery was done. Now it was about building the case, step by step, line by line. Police started with the phones. Each suspect had one. Each phone told a story. Messages, browser history, GPS data, all of it quietly revealing the work that went into a few seconds of violence. On Nasser's device, officers found searches from the day before. Richard Mille Watch Price UK, how to spot a fake Patek Philippe, most expensive watches Mayfair. This wasn't luck, it was preparation. His call log showed contact with Harkett in the hours leading up to the robbery. The two had messaged consistently for weeks. Short texts, mostly location drops and quick updates. Nothing obvious, but enough to map a pattern. The more they pulled, the clearer it became. This wasn't a one-time link-up. It was a partnership. Harkett's phone showed less, but not because he was cleaner, because he was smarter. He'd wiped messages regularly, deleted apps, and ran factory resets. But tech officers retrieved fragments from backups and cached data. Images of designer watches, mentions of Berkeley Square, even a saved map route starting from Shepherd Market, ending at the Sting site. The surveillance footage filled in the rest. Officers had captured every movement on the night of the robbery and several hours before it. One camera picked up the group tailing the undercover couple through central London. No talking, just close tracking. A second angle showed the suspects posted nearby for over 30 minutes, waiting, watching, moving only when the couple did. The case against Amiri and Muhammad came from a different angle. Neither man was arrested at the scene, but both were caught on CCTV. One walked ahead of the officers, looping back in time for the strike. The other hovered by a shop front, keeping lookout. Both disappeared moments after the robbery. Their movements lined up perfectly with those already in custody. The footage showed teamwork, even without words. When police raided addresses linked to the group, they found clothes matching those worn in the footage, burner phones, and a notebook containing scattered references to watches, names, and streets. The notes didn't spell out the crime, but they didn't need to. Witness statements added weight. One local worker recalled seeing the group gathered hours earlier near Curzon Street. He recognized one of them, Harkett, from a few weeks back, loitering in the same area. Small details, but each one fit. The group didn't operate out of a base. There were no safe houses. Instead, they moved on instinct, used public places to meet, and relied on knowledge of the area. But the evidence left behind, digital, physical, visual, was enough to hold. By the time the files were handed over to prosecutors, the timeline was clear. There was surveillance, there was planning, there was execution, and now there was proof. Luxury watches weren't just a target, they were the target. High value, easy to carry, easy to sell. For gangs like this, it was the perfect crime. Their victims fit a profile: tourists, businessmen, couples leaving high-end restaurants. Anyone wearing something that shimmered just enough to catch attention. The gang didn't stumble on them. They waited, they followed, and they chose their moment carefully. Mayfair was prime ground: Berkeley Square, Shepherd Market, Park Lane, places where money moved quietly, places where people didn't look over their shoulders. That's where the gang worked. Streets filled with Bentleys, Rolexes, and doormen who looked the other way. These weren't smash and grabs. They were silent, sudden lifts. The kind of thefts that victims didn't even feel at first. It was always a team job. One would spot, another would follow, a third would take the watch. And if needed, someone else stood ready to distract or block the victim's view. It took seconds, no weapons, no shouting, just speed and confidence. In some cases, they moved close enough to touch shoulders. A light brush, a question, a glance, just enough to break focus. Then the watch was gone, snapped from a wrist, hidden and passed on before anyone had time to react. What followed was confusion. Most victims didn't see who took it. Some didn't even realize until minutes later. By the time police were called, the gang was gone, slipped into side streets, phones off, clothes changed. They never stayed in one place too long. One moment they were outside a casino on Curzon Street. The next, loitering near the entrance of a private club. Always moving, always scanning. For them, it wasn't just about money, it was a routine. A job. Social media had already picked up the pattern. Clips from dash cams, doorbell cameras, and street CCTV started appearing online. One showed a man chasing a thief down Piccadilly after his Rolex vanished outside a bar. Another captured two men circling a woman in Knightsbridge, glancing at her wrist more than once before melting back into the crowd. The watches weren't kept long. Most were passed to middlemen the same day. Some went abroad, sold in Spain, France, even Dubai. Others were stripped for parts and resold quietly, each one worth thousands, each one untraceable once it changed hands. And this wasn't the only crew. Over the past 2 years, London had seen a sharp rise in designer watch thefts. Police estimated over 300 reported cases in the West End alone. Many followed the same method. Quick distraction, sudden grab, fast exit. The gang knew how to blend in. Trainers, slim-fit tracksuits, designer caps. Just enough style to pass as locals, but not enough to stand out. On CCTV, they looked like everyone else. That was the point. It was about control, knowing when to move, when to strike, and most of all, when to disappear. By the time the trial began, the evidence left little room to argue. Phone records, surveillance footage, and CCTV showed what happened in Berkeley Square, step by step. It was a robbery caught live, and the police were ready for it. Jacob Harkett pleaded guilty early. He was seen on camera grabbing the replica Patek Philippe from the female officer's wrist. His face, his actions, it was all clear. There was no way to dispute what the footage showed. Mohammed Nas denied the charge. He told police he'd been out for lunch, picked up cigarettes, and happened to walk through Shepherd Market. But his phone painted another picture. He had searched Richard Mayall watches the day before. His messages placed him in close contact with Harkett for months. He was near the robbery when it happened. Prosecutor Henry Lardlaw described him as part of the team, watching and ready. The jury agreed. It took 3 days to find him guilty. Janice Amiri and Adil Muhammad didn't show up to court. Both were convicted in their absence. Bench warrants were issued. They had been seen nearby, linked to the group by location data and prior activity. Officers gave detailed testimony, explaining how the sting worked. They described the movements from Berkeley Square to the arrest point, how the operation was built to draw the group in without giving them a chance to walk away. CCTV showed every angle, the gang following the officers, the watch being grabbed, the plainclothes team moving in. Nas stood close. He didn't react. He didn't leave. All 4 men were represented. All were given the chance to respond. But the evidence didn't leave gaps. Each part of the case supported the next. Phone logs, locations, footage, and contact between defendants. This wasn't an accident. And by the time verdicts were returned, the court had no doubt about what they were dealing with. The final chapter in the Rolex Rippers case hasn't fully closed, but the courtroom is ready. Sentencing for Jacob Harkett, Mohammed Nas, Janice Amiri, and Adel Muhammad has been set for June 2025. That delay hasn't come from uncertainty about guilt. It's come from a system under strain. All 4 men were found guilty, or, in Harkett's case, pleaded guilty. Yet their punishments are still pending, more than 6 months after the verdicts. The delay reflects the growing backlog in UK Crown courts, a bottleneck worsened by years of underfunding, staffing shortages, and a rising number of complex criminal cases waiting their turn. The courts can't sentence what they can't process fast enough. In this case, there's also the need for pre-sentence reports. These documents assess an offender's background, the risk they pose, and whether any mitigating factors might exist. For a crime like this, targeted robbery, planned and executed in public, with potential ties to wider networks, judges want every angle covered before passing sentence. Bench warrants remain active for Amiri and Mohammed, who never showed for trial and were convicted in absence. Their time is still coming, if and when they're caught. But for Harkit and Nas, the outcome will arrive soon enough. What happens next will speak volumes. Because this isn't just about a few stolen watches, it's about public confidence, policing strategy, and whether harsh sentences genuinely deter the next crew eyeing a Rolex in Mayfair. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Some don't care about the sentence. They're not planning for 5 years down the line. They're planning for 5 seconds, the time it takes to grab a £100,000 watch and vanish into the crowd. The courts will hand down years. But for others, that risk? Still worth it.